January 1946, Western Europe. The war is over, but the airfields are not silent. Cold wind moves across concrete still scarred by bomb craters and oil stains. Hangars stand half empty. Nations are counting losses. Armies are demobilizing. Fighters that once ruled the skies are being cut apart, sold for scrap, or pushed into quiet storage. And then, the engines start. Across former Axis territory, American aircraft lift into the gray morning air. Sleek, piston-driven fighters that were supposed to belong to yesterday. The P-51 Mustang climbs steadily, its Merlin engines smooth, confident, unchanged by surrender documents or peace treaties. Former Luftwaffe pilots watch from the ground. Some had fought this aircraft. Some had feared it. Most believed they would never see it fly again. They were wrong. The Mustang banks, accelerates, disappears into cloud. It does not struggle to exist in peacetime. It does not retreat before the promise of jets. It behaves as if the war simply shifted shape. For Axis observers, the shock is not nostalgia. It is calculation. This aircraft was meant to fade with the war. Instead, it is still here. And that realization opens a far deeper question, one that reaches beyond victory and defeat, into how air power truly survives history. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945 and Japan followed in August, the global assumption was clear. The age of the piston engine fighter was ending. The Second World War had been an industrial conflict, measured not just in territory, but in technology curves, and those curves appeared to point in only one direction, toward jets. Across Europe, the ruins of air power told a story of exhaustion. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared aerial force on the continent, had collapsed under fuel shortages, pilot attrition, and relentless Allied pressure. Aircraft like the Bf-109 and FW-190, machines that had dominated earlier phases of the war, were now grounded, destroyed, or captured. German jet programs, including the Me-262, had proven revolutionary but too late, too fragile, and too resource-intensive to change the outcome. In Japan, the situation was even more stark. Industrial capacity lay shattered, fuel was scarce, aircraft production had become desperate improvisation. By 1945, Japanese planners understood that air superiority was no longer a realistic objective. It was something to be endured, not challenged. Among Axis pilots and engineers who survived the war, a consensus formed quickly. Allied air power had won through mass, logistics, and time, not necessarily through permanence. The expectation was that American and British air forces would now contract. Wartime seats would be dismantled, thousands of aircraft would be scrapped, budgets would shrink. The United States in particular was assumed to be ready to demobilize and turn inward, as it had after the First World War. And within that expectation sat a technical assumption that seemed obvious. The P-51 Mustang had been a perfect weapon for a specific war. It was a long-range escort fighter, designed to solve a precise problem, protecting heavy bombers deep inside enemy territory. Its success came from endurance, speed, and high-altitude performance, qualities optimized for a strategic bombing campaign that theoretically would no longer be needed. Once the war ended, so the thinking went, the Mustang's relevance would vanish with it. Jets would take over, short-range interceptors would define air defense, the future would be faster, louder, and more complex. Propeller aircraft, no matter how refined, would become transitional relics. This belief was not limited to defeated nations. Many Allied planners shared it. The U.S. Army Air Forces had already begun shifting attention to jet propulsion before the war ended. The P-80 Shooting Star was entering service. Test pilots were pushing toward transonic speeds. Aviation journals spoke confidently about a new era. In that future, the Mustang appeared to have no place. It was tied to piston engines. It relied on propeller efficiency. Its lineage belonged to the 1930s, even if its refinement peaked in the 1940s. From a purely chronological standpoint, it looked finished. And yet, even as these assumptions settled into official doctrine, the reality on airfields told a quieter, contradictory story. Because the United States didn't scrap the Mustang, it kept it flying. Not out of sentiment, not out of nostalgia, but because when planners examined what they actually needed in the unstable years after the war, the P-51 refused to become obsolete. Its time, it turned out, had not expired with victory. The question then was why? When American planners reviewed their post-war position, they were not thinking in terms of celebration. They were thinking in terms of uncertainty. Victory had arrived faster than stability. Europe was shattered. Asia was volatile. Alliances were fragile. Former enemies were becoming intelligent subjects rather than battlefield targets, and former allies were already beginning to drift apart. In that environment, the future of air power looked far less clean than pre-war theorists had imagined. Jets existed, but they were not yet mature.
Early jet engines consumed fuel at staggering rates. Maintenance requirements were high. Range was limited. Reliability was uneven. For all their promise, jets were not ready to shoulder every role that wartime air forces had depended on. The P-51, by contrast, was already a known quantity. It was fast enough to challenge most early jets at lower altitudes. It had range that jets could not yet match. It could loiter, it could escort, it could strike, it could operate from damaged runways, it could be serviced by ground crews who already understood it intimately. In other words, it worked. This mattered far more than novelty. American logistics officers understood something that Axis planners had learned too late during the war. An aircraft's value is not measured only in speed or climb rate, but in how often it can fly, how easily it can be maintained, and how reliably it performs under imperfect conditions. The Mustang excelled in all three. This combination made the P-51 unusually flexible in a post-war world that had not yet decided what kind of war might come next. Occupation duties required patrols, demonstrations of presence, and rapid response capability, not high-speed interception alone. In Germany, Japan, and later across contested regions, American air units needed aircraft that could remain airborne for long periods and operate from limited infrastructure. Jets could not yet do that. The Mustang could. Former Axis intelligence officers began to notice this persistence almost immediately. Luftwaffe pilots who were now assisting Allied evaluations or writing internal reports remarked on the aircraft's continued visibility. They had expected to see it mothballed. Instead, they saw it reassigned, repainted, and retasked. To them, this was not just surprising, it was instructive. During the war, German planners had chased technical leaps in hopes of regaining initiative. Jet propulsion, rocket interceptors, and radical designs were pursued aggressively, often at the expense of refinement and mass deployment. The result was innovation without endurance. The Americans, in contrast, had taken a different path. They refined what worked. The Mustang's dominance had not come from a single breakthrough, but from cumulative improvement: airframe optimization, engine matching, fuel capacity, and pilot ergonomics. By 1945, it represented a system that had already absorbed years of combat feedback. Discarding it prematurely would have meant discarding that investment. So the United States did not. Instead, the Mustang was quietly repositioned. It became a bridge aircraft, linking wartime experience to post-war uncertainty. It filled gaps that jets could not yet cover. It trained new pilots. It enforced airspace. It served as a deterrent without requiring escalation. And critically, it was cheap relative to emerging alternatives. In an era when budgets were tightening and public pressure demanded demobilization, the Mustang offered capability without political friction. It did not look threatening in the way jets did. It did not symbolize escalation, yet it delivered readable power. This subtlety did not go unnoticed by former Axis observers. For pilots who had once faced the Mustang in combat, its survival carried an uncomfortable message. They had believed the aircraft was dangerous because it was numerous, or because it had superior fuel, or because it flew with overwhelming bomber formations. But its post-war presence stripped away those explanations. Now it flew alone, or in small groups, without bombers, without total war behind it. And it still mattered. That forced a reevaluation, not just of the aircraft, but of the assumptions that had guided Axis aviation doctrine. The Mustang's endurance suggested that flexibility mattered more than specialization, that logistics could outweigh innovation, that maturity could defeat novelty. By the late 1940s, this realization was reinforced by another development, one that would remove all remaining doubt. The P-51 was about to return to combat, not as a relic, not as a placeholder, but as a frontline aircraft, once again proving that its relevance had never been tied to a single war. And when that happened, the disbelief first felt on quiet European airfields would turn into something far more concrete.
For many former Axis pilots, the end of the war did not mean the end of reflection. In captivity, demobilization, or post-war interviews, they replayed the air war repeatedly: what worked, what failed, what might have changed the outcome. And among all Allied aircraft, the P-51 Mustang occupied a unique place in those memories. This was not because it was the fastest aircraft they had faced, nor because it climbed better than everything else. It was because it arrived where it was never supposed to be. German fighter pilots had trained for interception. They expected enemy escorts to break off. They expected windows of vulnerability. Before the Mustang, bomber streams had limits. There were distances beyond which German airspace felt temporarily safe. The P-51 erased that feeling. What unsettled Axis pilots after the war was realizing that the same aircraft that had shattered those assumptions was still flying, still trusted, still relevant. Many had believed that its dominance came from wartime excess, fuel abundance, overwhelming numbers, and a strategic bombing doctrine that would disappear with peace. Seeing Mustangs fly in 1946 and 1947 forced a more personal conclusion. They had not been beaten by a temporary advantage. They had been beaten by a system that aged well. For pilots trained to think in terms of performance margins and tactical edges, this was deeply uncomfortable. It meant their defeat was not simply circumstantial, it was structural, and that realization lingered. Angle 2, the technological angle: why the Mustang aged slower than expected. From a technical standpoint, the P-51 should not have survived into the jet era. It was a propeller-driven aircraft whose basic design traced back to the late 1930s. On paper, it belonged to the same generation as fighters that had already been eclipsed. But the Mustang's design philosophy made it unusually resistant to aging. Its laminar flow wing reduced drag and improved efficiency at cruise speeds. This was not a feature optimized for a single combat maneuver, but for sustained flight. Its fuselage was clean, streamlined, and adaptable. Internal fuel capacity allowed for long-range operations without excessive external drag. Most importantly, its power plant was not an experimental leap, it was a perfected solution. The Merlin engine represented the peak of piston engine refinement. By the end of the war, it was reliable, powerful, and well understood. Unlike early jet engines, it did not demand constant redesign. It rewarded familiarity and discipline. To Axis engineers reviewing captured aircraft or post-war intelligence summaries, this mattered. They had pursued innovation aggressively, often sacrificing reliability for performance gains. The Mustang demonstrated the opposite approach, incremental improvement layered onto a sound aerodynamic foundation. As a result, it did not become obsolete quickly, it simply became predictable, and predictability in military aviation is power. Angle 3, the leadership angle, doctrine versus assumptions. Another reason the Mustang endured lay not in the aircraft itself, but in how American leadership thought about air power. During the war, U.S. commanders had learned that flexibility mattered more than specialization. Aircraft that could only perform one role were liabilities in a dynamic conflict. The Mustang, originally conceived as a fighter, evolved into an escort, a ground attack platform, and a reconnaissance asset. That adaptability did not disappear with peace. Post-war American doctrine emphasized readiness without provocation. The P-51 fit this posture perfectly. It could demonstrate presence without escalation. It could patrol without announcing technological intimidation. It could be deployed widely without logistical strain. Axis planners, by contrast, had built doctrines around decisive moments, short wars, rapid breakthroughs, technological shocks. When those moments failed to materialize or passed too quickly, their systems struggled to adapt. Seeing the Mustang remain in service highlighted that difference in philosophy. The aircraft was not just a tool, it was a reflection of a doctrine that valued sustainability over spectacle. Angle 4, the enemy perspective, disbelief without denial. What made the Mustang's persistence especially striking was that former Axis observers did not dismiss it. They did not claim it was outdated. They did not argue it survived only because no one challenged it. Instead, they acknowledged its continued relevance. Reports written by former Luftwaffe officers assisting Allied evaluations noted the aircraft's versatility and cost-effectiveness. Japanese aviation analysts studying post-war American deployments recognized that the Mustang filled roles jets could not yet assume. This was not bitterness speaking, it was professional recognition. The enemy understood what the Mustang represented, a refusal to abandon effective solutions simply because a new era had been announced. And that understanding would become even sharper when the aircraft faced combat conditions once again. Because theory, observation, and memory can all be debated, combat cannot. The Mustang was about to enter a new war and remove any remaining doubt about whether it truly belonged to the past. For defeated nations, peace is not immediate relief, it is a prolonged reckoning. For former Axis pilots and engineers, that reckoning unfolded in stages, first with surrender, then with occupation, and finally with observation. They watched the forces that had beaten them reorganize, adapt, and prepare for futures they would not control. In that long aftermath, the continued presence of the P-51 carried psychological weight far beyond its technical specifications. The Mustang had been a symbol of inevitability during the war. It arrived with the bombers. It stayed when others turned back. It denied the possibility of relief. When it reappeared after the war, that same inevitability resurfaced, but stripped of the chaos of combat. Now it flew without urgency, without desperation, without an enemy actively contesting its dominance. For Axis veterans, this was unsettling. Victory, they had believed, would end the relationship between attacker and defender. Instead, the aircraft that had enforced defeat remained visible, almost routine, as if the war's outcome had been permanently engraved into the skies. This was not intimidation by force, it was intimidation by continuity. The Mustang's endurance suggested that American air power did not rely on constant escalation to remain credible. It could maintain pressure simply by existing, by refusing to age out of relevance. Psychologically, this mattered. It implied that even in peacetime, the balance of power had already been decided. Angle 6, the economic angle, power that made sense. One of the least dramatic but most decisive reasons for the P-51 survival was economics. Post-war governments faced enormous pressure to reduce military spending. Public tolerance for large defense budgets was limited. Aircraft that demanded expensive infrastructure, specialized fuel, or constant redesign were politically vulnerable. The Mustang avoided these pitfalls. It was already paid for. Its production lines were mature. Its supply chains were established. Spare parts were plentiful. Maintenance crews were trained. Airfields were compatible. In contrast, jets required new everything. New training pipelines, new maintenance doctrines, new runways, new logistics. They represented future capability, but also future cost. From a purely strategic budgeting perspective, the P-51 offered immediate credible power at a fraction of the expense. Axis analysts noted this too. During the war, Germany and Japan had both suffered from overextension. Advanced programs starved of resources while proven systems deteriorated. The Mustang's post-war role appeared to confirm a lesson learned too late. Sustainability wins wars longer than innovation alone. Angle 7, the tactical angle, versatility over specialization.
In the immediate post-war years, no one could predict where the next conflict would erupt or what form it would take. Would it be a high-altitude air war, a colonial conflict, a civil war, a proxy engagement? The P-51 did not require an answer to remain useful. It could fly reconnaissance, it could escort transport aircraft, it could conduct ground attack missions, it could operate in environments where infrastructure was minimal. It could transition between roles without significant modification. Jets, by comparison, were optimized for specific tasks, usually interception. Their performance advantages existed at the edges of envelopes that peacetime missions rarely demanded. For American planners, this made the Mustang a hedge against uncertainty. For Axis observers, it revealed another uncomfortable truth. The aircraft that had defeated them was not just powerful, it was adaptable. Angle 4. The Cold War Shadow. A bridge into the future. As the late 1940s unfolded, global tension did not disappear, it shifted. The former Axis powers became pieces in a larger geopolitical contest. Europe divided, Asia destabilized. The Cold War emerged not with declarations, but with deployments. In this environment, the Mustang found a new identity. It became a transitional instrument, connecting World War II air power to Cold War realities. It filled the gap while jet technology matured. It allowed the United States to project presence without committing to irreversible escalation. Former Axis military professionals recognized this strategy immediately. They had lived through transitions handled poorly, shifts that were rushed, under-resourced, or ideologically driven. Watching the Mustang remain operational suggested a different approach. Evolve slowly, discard nothing prematurely, and let reality, not theory, dictate replacement. That philosophy had defeated them once. Now it was shaping the post-war world. And then, in 1950, reality intervened. Theories ended, transitions accelerated, and the P-51, against all expectations, was called back into combat. What followed would not merely validate its survival, it would transform disbelief into proof.
By the late 1940s, the debate around the P-51 had grown quieter, not because it was resolved, but because it seemed academic. The aircraft continued to fly. It continued to train pilots. It continued to patrol contested airspace. But many still believed this was merely inertia, a temporary overlap between eras. Then the world changed again. In June 1950, war broke out on the Korean Peninsula. What had been an abstract Cold War tension suddenly became kinetic. Armies moved. Borders dissolved. Air power was needed immediately, not in the future, not once doctrine caught up, but now. The United States Air Force faced a familiar problem under unfamiliar conditions. Jet aircraft were available, but they were not ready in the numbers or configurations required. The F-80 Shooting Star, America's primary jet fighter, suffered from limited range. Operating from distant bases, it struggled to remain over targets long enough to influence ground combat. Forward airfields were primitive, damaged, or non-existent. Logistics lagged behind advancing lines. The war did not wait for theory. So the Mustang returned. Redesignated as the F-51, the aircraft was pulled from reserve units, training squadrons, and foreign deployments. Within weeks, it was flying combat missions over Korea, this time not as a bomber escort, but as a ground attack and close air support platform. For observers who had once believed the Mustang belonged to the past, this moment was decisive. The aircraft was no longer surviving on reputation. It was being tested again, under fire. Axis veterans, now analysts, historians, or civilian engineers, watched closely. Many had assumed that if the Mustang ever faced modern combat again, its limitations would finally surface. Jets, they believed, would render it irrelevant by speed alone. Instead, the opposite occurred. The realities of the Korean battlefield favored endurance over velocity. Targets were dispersed, weather was unpredictable, terrain was rugged, communication was imperfect. Pilots needed time over the battlefield, not brief high-speed passes. The Mustang delivered that time. Its ability to loiter, to identify targets visually, and to strike with precision made it invaluable to ground commanders. Its piston engine, often dismissed as outdated, proved resilient under rough operating conditions. It could absorb damage. It could operate from shorter, less developed airstrips. Jets could not yet do this reliably. As the F-51 flew mission after mission, it became clear that the aircraft was not filling a gap, it was defining the role. This realization carried particular weight for former Axis airmen. They had once believed that speed alone would determine the future of air combat, that technological leaps would erase earlier designs. But here was the Mustang, surviving not by competing with jets on their terms, but by excelling where they could not yet function. The lesson was brutal in its clarity. The future had not arrived evenly. For the United States, this validated years of pragmatic planning. The decision to retain the P-51 had not been conservative, it had been realistic. The aircraft's continued service was not an accident, it was insurance. For those who had once faced it as enemies, the conclusion was unavoidable. They had underestimated the durability of American air power, not because they misunderstood innovation, but because they misunderstood restraint. The Mustang was never meant to be the fastest forever. It was meant to be useful for as long as possible. And in Korea,
That philosophy proved decisive. The turning point was not a single battle or sortie. It was the cumulative realization that the P-51 was no longer surviving on legacy alone. It was shaping the present. As the war intensified, one final test remained, one that would silence any remaining doubt about whether the Mustang truly belonged to history. It was about to face a new kind of enemy in the same sky. By late 1950, the Korean War had escalated beyond initial expectations. What began as a regional conflict was now entangled in global power politics. Chinese forces entered the war, Soviet-backed equipment appeared on the battlefield, and for the first time since 1945, air combat involved both propeller-driven aircraft and jet fighters operating in the same theater. This was the moment many had been waiting for. The arrival of the MiG-15 over Korea seemed to confirm everything post-war theorists had predicted. Sleek, fast, and armed with heavy cannons, the MiG represented a new generation of air combat. It outperformed the Mustang in speed and climb rate. It could dictate engagement terms. On paper, the P-51 had no chance. And yet, that paper comparison failed to capture reality. The MiG-15 was designed primarily for high-altitude interception. Its strengths lay in speed and firepower, not endurance or low-altitude maneuvering. It excelled against bombers and jets, but struggled in the close, terrain-focused environment where the Mustang now operated. The F-51's mission profile placed it below the MiG's preferred fighting envelope. It flew low and slow, close to the ground, providing direct support to advancing or retreating forces. In this role, speed was less valuable than control. Axis veterans observing these developments recognized the pattern immediately. They had seen similar mismatches during the Second World War, aircraft designed for theoretical dominance faltering under practical constraints. The Mustang, once again, exploited those constraints. While jets dueled at altitude, the F-51 shaped the battlefield below. Its presence was constant, its impact was cumulative. It destroyed supply lines, disrupted troop movements, and provided psychological reassurance to ground forces who could hear it overhead. This distinction mattered. Victory in Korea was not determined solely by air-to-air kill ratios. It depended on ground momentum, logistics, and morale. The Mustang influenced all three. For former Axis pilots, the shock was no longer emotional, it was analytical. They had assumed that relevance ended where performance charts peaked. The P-51 demonstrated that relevance is defined by mission alignment, not maximum capability. This realization forced a reevaluation of everything they had believed about technological progression. The Mustang was not competing with jets, it was bypassing them. Even when jets dueled headlines, the P-51 quietly accumulated results. It did not need to win dogfights to justify its existence. It needed only to matter. And it did. As the war progressed, the Mustang's limitations did eventually surface. Losses mounted as ground fire improved. The aircraft was vulnerable in ways jets were not. By 1953, it was clear that the transition to jet-powered close air support was inevitable. But inevitability did not erase significance. The Mustang had outlived its supposed era by nearly a decade. It had fought in 2 wars. It had adapted to radically different roles. It had forced enemies, past and present, to confront the same truth repeatedly. Good design does not age on schedule. For Axis observers, this was the final proof. They had not been stunned because America kept the Mustang dominant after the war. They were stunned because it worked. And that reality, quiet, unglamorous, and undeniable, reshaped how air power would be understood in the decades that followed. The guns would eventually fall silent in Korea. Jets would take center stage. The Mustang would finally step aside. But it would not vanish as a relic. It would remain as a benchmark, a reminder that effectiveness, once achieved, does not obey the calendar. When the Korean War settled into stalemate and armistice talks began, military planners were left not with triumph, but with ledgers. Losses counted, missions analyzed, assumptions corrected. Among the most quietly consequential of those corrections was the reassessment of what the P-51 Mustang had become after the Second World War. It was no longer possible to describe the aircraft as a holdover or an interim solution. The Mustang had shaped outcomes. Its impact in Korea was not measured in air superiority charts or jet versus prop comparisons. It was measured in bridges destroyed, columns halted, evacuations covered, and ground units kept alive under pressure. It had been called upon because it could do what newer aircraft could not yet do reliably, and it delivered under conditions that punished theory. This forced a strategic recalibration. American airplanners emerged from Korea with a more restrained understanding of technological transition. Jets were clearly the future, no serious analyst disputed that. But the war demonstrated that replacing proven systems too quickly created gaps that adversaries could exploit and that soldiers on the ground would pay for. The Mustang became the central case study in that lesson. Rather than being remembered as a wartime artifact extended by necessity, it was reclassified in post-war analysis as a platform whose design philosophy had allowed it to outlive its intended era. Its longevity reframed how air forces thought about life cycle, replacement timing, and role overlap. Former Axis professionals, now largely removed from military command but deeply engaged in aviation analysis, reached similar conclusions. In Germany, where post-war rearmament would eventually occur under strict political constraints, the Mustang's history loomed large. The aircraft represented something the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve during the war, a balance between innovation and endurance. It had not chased the edge of performance at the expense of stability. It had matured instead of mutating. For Japanese aviation analysts, the lesson was even starker. Their wartime experience had been defined by increasingly desperate specialization, aircraft built for single missions, often flown under catastrophic conditions. The Mustang's adaptability highlighted the cost of that approach. The aftermath of Korea also altered how defeat itself was interpreted. Axis pilots had once framed their losses in terms of resource imbalance and strategic circumstance. Those explanations remained valid, but the Mustang's post-war dominance added another layer. It suggested that part of their defeat had been philosophical. They had pursued decisive breakthroughs. The Americans had pursued systems that endured. That distinction reshaped post-war aviation thinking far beyond the United States. Nations rebuilding their air forces, whether aligned with the West or navigating non-aligned paths, studied the Mustang's record closely. Many did not seek to replicate the aircraft itself, but the logic behind it. Prioritize range, reliability, and adaptability over narrow performance advantages. Even as jets rapidly replaced piston fighters in frontline roles, the influence of the Mustang lingered in doctrine, procurement philosophy, and operational planning. It had delayed the rush toward specialization. It had reinforced caution during transition. It had demonstrated that relevance is situational, not generational. Perhaps most significantly, the P-51 altered how victory was remembered. For Axis veterans, the aircraft's continued presence meant that defeat did not end with surrender. It extended into the post-war world, into analysis rooms and air shows, and foreign air bases where Mustangs still flew. Quiet reminders that the system they had faced was not only powerful, but patient. The war had ended. The consequences had not. And as the Mustang story settled into military history, its influence continued to ripple outward, towards doctrines, designs, and decisions that would shape air power long after the aircraft itself finally left the sky.
By the mid-1950s, the P-51 Mustang was no longer a frontline aircraft in the world's most advanced air forces. Jets had matured, infrastructure had improved, doctrine had shifted decisively towards speed, altitude, and nuclear delivery systems. On the surface, the transition appeared complete. But legacy does not disappear when service ends. The Mustang's post-war influence endured in ways that were subtle, structural, and long-lasting, especially in how former Axis nations and emerging air powers interpreted the meaning of technological dominance. For Germany, now rebuilding under NATO alignment, the lessons were philosophical rather than practical. The new Luftwaffe would never fly the P-51 in combat, but its officers studied it extensively. The aircraft symbolized what wartime German aviation had lacked in its final years: restraint in innovation, coherence in design priorities, and respect for logistical reality. The Mustang was not remembered as an American miracle. It was remembered as an American decision. That distinction mattered. It suggested that superiority was not achieved by chasing every technological horizon simultaneously, but by committing fully to designs that could evolve without losing identity. The Mustang's refinement over time, rather than reinvention, stood in contrast to late-war Axis programs that attempted to leap ahead without securing the ground beneath them. In Japan, where aviation development resumed under strict post-war limitations, the Mustang's legacy informed civilian and military thinking alike. Engineers and planners emphasized efficiency, reliability, and adaptability, principles that echoed the P-51's design philosophy. Beyond former Axis nations, the Mustang's post-war career influenced a generation of smaller air forces. As the United States supplied or sold surplus aircraft abroad, Mustangs appeared in the inventories of allied and non-aligned countries alike. For many of these nations, the aircraft represented access to credible air power without the cost or complexity of jet fleets. This global dispersion reinforced the Mustang's symbolic power. It became a shared reference point, an aircraft that had proven itself across wars, climates, and doctrines. For pilots who flew it long after the Second World War, its reputation was not inherited, it was earned anew. Former Axis observers, watching this spread, recognized something unsettling. The aircraft that had defeated them was no longer uniquely American, it had become universal, a benchmark by which others measured their own capabilities. Its dominance had outlived the conflict that gave it meaning. This, perhaps more than anything, explained the enduring sense of disbelief. The Mustang was supposed to belong to a specific moment in history. Instead, it escaped that moment entirely. As decades passed, the P-51's presence shifted from operational to symbolic. It appeared in air shows, museums, and memorial flights, not as nostalgia, but as a reminder of a particular kind of victory, one achieved not through dramatic technological rupture, but through disciplined evolution. For historians and veterans alike, the aircraft came to represent a broader truth about warfare. Wars are not won solely by the newest weapon. They are won by the most suitable one.
The Axis pilots who had once watched the Mustang arrive over their cities during the war and then watched it continue flying after peace understood this truth with painful clarity. They had prepared for a future that arrived too quickly and unevenly. The Americans had prepared for uncertainty itself. That difference shaped outcomes long after surrender documents were signed. When the Mustang finally disappeared from active military service, it did so without ceremony. There were no declarations, no abrupt end. It simply stepped aside once replacements could truly assume its roles. And that quiet exit was fitting, because the P-51 story after the war was never about spectacle. It was about endurance. It was about an aircraft that refused to obey the timeline assigned to it, and in doing so forced both allies and enemies to reconsider what dominance actually means. What remained was not just a machine, but a lesson. And that lesson would echo long after the sound of Merlin engines faded from the sky. When the Second World War ended, history seemed ready to move on. New borders were drawn, new alliances formed. New technologies promised to rewrite the rules of conflict. In that forward momentum, the P-50 Mustang should have been left behind, an artifact of a finished war, preserved in memory but no longer relevant. Instead, it lingered. Not because it resisted change, but because it had been built for uncertainty from the beginning. The Mustang was never the loudest symbol of American power. It did not announce a revolution, it did not redefine physics. What it did was quieter and far more enduring. It solved real problems. For Axis pilots who watched it fly after defeat, that persistence carried an uncomfortable clarity. The aircraft they had faced was not dangerous because it was temporary. It was dangerous because it fit the world as it actually existed, messy, unpredictable, and resistant to clean transitions. The Mustang outlasted its moment because it was never designed only for a moment. Its range, reliability, and adaptability allowed it to migrate from total war into uneasy peace and then back into conflict again when history demanded it. It bridged eras not through speed, but through relevance. That is why it stunned those who once opposed it. They had prepared for a future defined by dramatic leaps, by jets that would instantly erase the past, by singular breakthroughs that would reset the balance of power. What they encountered instead was continuity, an adversary that did not discard effectiveness simply because a new age had been declared. In the end, the Mustang did not dominate after the war because it was unbeatable. It dominated because it remained useful. And that distinction matters. Wars do not end cleanly. Technologies do not retire on schedule. History advances unevenly, favoring systems that can endure uncertainty rather than chase perfection. The Mustang's post-war legacy revealed a deeper truth about power itself. Victory is not only about reaching the future first. Sometimes it's about arriving there prepared, carrying forward what still works, and letting go only when reality allows it. Long after the engine stopped, that lesson remained. Quiet, unromantic, and impossible to ignore.
And as the structure continued to organize itself around protection rather than joint suffering, the work of emotions in the family fell almost entirely to those members who had always done the work of emotions. Not immediately, of course. It was a process, one of which one became less aware the longer it continued. The wives who had been so strong began to realize that their strength was no longer an option. It was an expectation, Perry explains on her blog at the New York Times. The ability to cope was assumed, she continues. The ability to adapt was taken for granted. When there were changes in their husbands' communication or their distance, Perry says, they adapted, they rationalized, they explained away. The wife's role in a marriage where there is a bipolar husband. Robin did not have to devise ways for coping. Not because she refused to. However, because the system intervened before that was necessary. This is important because its meaning lies, in fact, largely outside itself, in the lives that are lived, and endurance, once actually experienced, always becomes something less than itself, because endurance doesn't just apply to survival, it applies to how often one must be called on to normalize that experience. The wives who endured are those that were repeatedly told, directly or indirectly, that waiting was part of the process, that uncertainty was temporary. Robin was rarely asked to wait in the same manner. Her place in the family was marked by immediacy. If there was a sense that something was not right, then an issue was brought up. If something was distressing, then that warranted attention. If a problem had the potential to cause a destabilization effect, then the issue was fixed. This had a cumulative effect that ensured two different worlds coexisted as part of the same family. One reality that was made possible by patience was one reality. The other by protection. The above realities began drifting apart. Women who suffered learned to control themselves in seclusion. She learned to accept the absence of consistent presence. She learned to cope with disappointment in secret. The power of enduring in such a way is building strength, but also the distance in a way that the strength is not acknowledged. By contrast, the world around Robin was relatively sheltered. The emotional continuity was kept intact as the rest of the family fractured. This is no coincidence. It began with small decisions made many times that weighed the value of continuity in one situation against justice elsewhere. These preferences weren't framed as favoritism within their family. These were couched in terms of practicality. It was simpler to focus attention where attention seemed to make a difference, simpler to put effort back into the surroundings where that effort was met with positivity, simpler to sustain what seemed to be in good working order. But there are consequences to being practical. This creates a ripple effect that changes relationships across the board. The wives that suffered through this were starting to feel like they were lacking in emotions, not just in time and attention, but recognition. Their work was necessary but unrecognized. Patience was expected but not rewarded. This established a quiet emotional hierarchy. Rather one founded on authority, but on accommodation. Those who suffered were expected to continue to suffer. Those who were safeguarded were expected to continue to be safeguarded, and when that happened, their behavior was governed by these expectations, not by words. Robin was never supposed to have to live with permanence in the ways of persistent neglect or circumstances of doubt, given the lessons the system had learned regarding the disrupting impact it in turn had created for the environment it had come to cherish and value. Robin's displeasure mattered. Other people's displeasure was normal. It is where imbalance begins. That normalization is where the seed of imbalance. It informs people of what they can and are entitled to expect. It teaches them what they must tolerate. It also teaches them the nature of their pain, whether it will be acted upon or waited for. With time, the wives who stuck it out stopped counting on relief. They did not stop hoping altogether, but hope became low-key, cautious, less invested in the outcome. The struggle for survival, once personified as love, now just seemed like struggle for struggle's sake. Robin was not faced with such a change. Lessons that came easily to her, however, include that pain is a catalyst for change, that complacency is something to guard against, and that her emotional needs are not only valid but actionable. It wasn't about assigning blame, as I've said repeatedly. It was all about structure, remembers. Structures are what teach people what to look out for and what not to. By this point, the gap in expectation had already changed the family's emotional economy. Vigilance had become a matter that only some wives were to consider. Protection had already become a service that only one family could expect. And once the pattern was evident, it simply could not be ignored. Once the emotional economy had shifted, the effects started to manifest in a way that could no longer be dismissed by mere circumstance. The women who suffered found themselves dealing with an ever-growing sense of isolation, not because they lacked inclusion, but because they were being forced to compartmentalize their experiences. Trouble was no longer a shared collective experience, but a personal problem. Endurance, until then a community responsibility, is now individualized labor. Each wife was expected to cope with her own pain, to manage her own disillusionment, to construe absence on a temporary basis rather than structural. The answers that responded to questions rarely focused upon the trend, but rather upon the instant. This ensured that the system remained intact. Within this system, the role that Robin had in it would still be determined by the concept of protection. She would consider her family environment to be an area that needed to be protected or maintained in the right way. Emotional consistency in this space would take precedence, even if it means having emotional lack elsewhere. In this way, a self-reinforcing cycle would be produced over time, wherein the more consistent the space would be, the more it would be worth saving. Stability became empirical data. Evidence that things were working. Evidence that right decisions were being made. Evidence of what was being paid for order for something to remain intact. However, stability in one family didn't mean stability in the family. It just meant that the instability was channeled elsewhere. But the wives who stayed began to realize the impact of such a shift of focus, not necessarily in the form of angry resentment, but of weary exhaustion, the kind that comes from being repeatedly asked to comprehend without being comprehended, to change without there ever being change, to remain understanding when the deadline is always an eternity away. Robin did not have to work in such environments. Once more, not because she refused to. However, since the system protected her from them. This served to change the mindset regarding sacrifice. The sacrifices that others have to make became background noise. They became the norm. Any suffering that Robin had to withstand became a sign that something was wrong. Signals trigger actions. Background noise doesn't. Background noise. It changed the dynamic in terms of how decisions were made, because when there were trade-off for decisions, trade-offs were usually where resilience had already been normalized. The idea was that those women could deal with it because they always had to. To survive became proof of strength, rather than evidence requiring relief. This logic made sense within the system. It enabled decisions to be made quickly. It minimized friction. It sustained the illusion of progress, but it also widened the gap between promise and reality. Instead, the wives who endured began to sense that their strength was being used against them. All parties in the story have their own purposes, and their capacity to cope warranted requiring them to cope further. Their flexibility warranted requiring them to bend once again. Their patience warranted waiting once again. Robin's experience proved the opposite lesson. This resulted in an adjustment. This lack of certainty resulted in a need for reassessment. Her needs influenced the outcomes. Neither lesson was explicitly taught. Both were learned through repetition. All of these teachings had an impact on not only how the wives treated the family, but how they treated themselves. The everlasting wives began to wonder if their needs were justified, if having consistency was expecting too much, if being uncomfortable was just part of the job of dating. Robin never found herself asking those questions either. Her needs have always been met through actions. This inequity did not have to happen for nefarious purposes. It simply had to exist for long enough to feel permanent. And that is what endurance is, once relief is no longer expected. At this point, the family was not just adapting to different expectations, but it was sustaining them too. The system was based on sheltered upbringing and guaranteed its own endurance. It needed some wives to be stable themselves to ensure their own wife is balanced and steady. And this dependence was no longer invisible. This was impacting outcomes.